Have you ever walked into a room you've worked in for most of your life and realized before anyone even spoke that you no longer belonged there? That everything you had built was already being handed to someone else? That's how it started. The meeting invite came late the night before. No explanation, just a title, transition planning. That word alone told me everything. I arrived on time, as always, 9 o'clock sharp. The hallway was quiet, the kind of quiet that makes you slow down without meaning to. I paused outside the conference room door. Inside, I could already see them. Jason was pouring himself coffee from the pot I had brought in every Monday for the last 15 years. He didn't look up. Across from him sat the new CEO, Jordan Trent. He was younger than I expected. Polished suit, silver tie clip, not a strand of hair out of place. His head was down, flipping through a folder. He didn't stop when I entered. The HR manager nodded, but it wasn't a greeting. It was the kind of nod you give when something's already been decided. I stood there for a moment, just long enough to let them feel the weight of my silence. Then I took the only empty seat. The chair was too low and the back wobbled slightly. No one offered to adjust it. The HR manager began reading from a script. I knew it was a script. I had helped write one like it years ago when we had to close 2 distribution routes and let go of a dozen drivers. The tone was always the same. Careful, corporate, distant. "We're restructuring our leadership model," she said, "looking toward a younger, more scalable future." She said it with a calm voice, but the message hit hard. You're not needed anymore. Not because you did anything wrong, just because you've been here too long. I glanced at Jason. He was folding a napkin in half over and over again like he didn't know where to put his hands. He was the same young man I had trained straight out of college. I taught him how to read route maps by hand, how to handle vendor calls at 3 a.m., how to reroute frozen shipments in a snowstorm. Now he wouldn't meet my eyes. Jordan finally looked up. He didn't smile. He just said, "We're grateful for your years of service. We'd like to offer you an early retirement package. Full benefits, no hard feelings." I asked, why now? Jordan didn't hesitate. "We want to modernize our vendor relationships, streamline things, less dependency on legacy systems." Legacy systems, that was me. I didn't respond. There was nothing to say that would change anything. I reached for the envelope on the table. My name was typed across the top, slightly off-center like someone had printed it in a hurry. No handshake, no plaque, no... "Thank you for keeping this place running when the servers failed, when the snow blocked the roads, when no one else picked up the phone." Just a signature line and a deadline to return my key card. I stood up slowly. My hands were steady. I had packed up my desk the night before. I didn't need a speech. I didn't want a cake in the break room. What I wanted was to leave before I let them see just how deep that kind of silence can cut. I walked out of that building the way I had walked in every day for 25 years, with my back straight, my bag in my left hand, and my thoughts kept to myself. But this time, no one called out behind me. No one asked where I was going. No one stopped me to say goodbye. And that silence was louder than anything they could have said. If you've ever sat through a meeting where everyone talked about the future and made it clear you weren't part of it, you're not alone. Tell me where you're listening from, and if this story feels familiar, stay with me. The system may have forgotten us, but the people who built it still remember. The morning after I left, I woke up at the same time I always did, 5:30, no alarm, no reason. The house was still dark, the way it had been for years whenever I left for those early shifts. But this time, there was no truck waiting, no backup call, no driver stranded at the depot, just my coffee maker humming quietly and a thin strip of sunrise peeking through the blinds. I sat at the kitchen table with both hands wrapped around the mug as if the warmth could keep me from unraveling. It didn't. I wasn't angry. That surprised me. I wasn't sad either. Not in the way people expect. What I felt was empty, like I'd stepped out of my own life and no one noticed the door had opened. Later that day, I opened a drawer I hadn't touched in years. Inside was a soft, worn notebook with a rubber band around it. The old kind with graph paper pages and hand-drawn route maps, vendor names, driver birthdays, notes from hauler dispatchers. One page was nothing but the word Nancy and a doodle of a cake. She liked chocolate but couldn't eat nuts. I had written that down after she got sick once on a delivery run. This wasn't company property. This was memory. I flipped through the pages slowly, like I was visiting a place I no longer lived in. Each note, each scribbled reminder, wasn't just about delivery times or cost per mile. It was trust, years of it, quietly built, never written into any contract. There were vendors who had never sent an email. They just called me directly. Suppliers who worked through the holidays only because I adjusted their schedules to fit around school plays or church picnics. None of that showed up in a quarterly report. And now, the people replacing me wouldn't know any of it. Jason. He'd always been bright, but he didn't see the space between numbers. He didn't hear the tone in a driver's voice when they were covering too many routes in one week. He didn't know that Ramon's brother handled pickups on Fridays because Ramon had dialysis. I never wrote that down. I just remembered. They had promoted a man who knew the system, but not the people inside it. That afternoon, I opened my email and began writing. Not to the company, not to Jordan, to the people who mattered. One by one, I reached out to the vendors I'd worked with for more than a decade. Not a mass message, not a BCC list. Each email was personal. Each one thanked them for their years of partnership. Each one ended with, "I've stepped away from the company, but I wanted you to have my direct contact in case anything ever needs clarification. I wish you nothing but success." For 6 others, the ones I trusted most, I wrote letters by hand. I sat at the table that night with a stack of stationery and my favorite pen. It took hours. My fingers ached, but I wanted them to feel it, to know I meant every word. I didn't say a bad thing about Jason. I didn't mention the meeting. I didn't need to. People in this industry know how to read between the lines. They could tell something had shifted. And the smart ones? They'd already started asking themselves what else was about to change. The first response didn't come by email. It came by mail, real mail, the kind with stamps and creases and a return address written in shaky block letters. It was from Carl, a vendor I'd worked with for nearly 18 years. He used to joke that I was the only reason he stayed on contract through 2 corporate shakeups. Inside the envelope was a folded piece of paper. Nothing fancy, just a torn-out sheet from a notepad. One sentence written in dark blue ink. "If you're not there anymore, we won't be either." That was it. No greeting, no signature, but I knew it was him. I remembered the handwriting. I remembered the way he always looped his capital R's. And I remembered the time I rerouted a delayed shipment so he could be home in time for his daughter's graduation. That wasn't on any report. That wasn't in any dashboard. But he remembered. That afternoon, I walked past the stack of outgoing letters I had written the day before and pulled them back from the entry table. I opened each one again, slowly, like they were living things, not just pieces of paper. Then I added one more line to the bottom of each. "If anything needs clarification, I'm still available." I didn't say how. I didn't explain what that meant. I just signed my name, not as director of logistics, not as consultant, just Lydia. I mailed them before the sun went down. The post office clerk looked at the stack and asked, "Big event?" I said no, just tying up some loose ends. She smiled, the kind of polite smile you give when you don't know the whole story. And I didn't offer it. The next morning, I set my phone face down on the kitchen counter. I wasn't waiting for calls, but when I flipped it over after breakfast, there were 2 missed calls and a text. The number was from Montana. The message was from Lewis, one of the longest-running drivers in our system. He wrote, "So it's true? You're really gone?" I didn't answer right away. I read it twice. Then I turned the phone over again and went outside. The wind was sharp, the kind that carried the smell of dry leaves and truck brake dust. I stood on the porch for a long time, listening to nothing in particular, just breathing. When I came back inside, the phone buzzed again. Another message, this one longer. It was from Carla, a vendor coordinator who always preferred phone calls over emails. She said she'd been trying to resolve a billing discrepancy but didn't know who to talk to anymore. Jason had routed her to someone else, someone who told her to check the notes. But there were no notes. She wrote, "You would have caught this 2 weeks ago." I didn't feel proud when I read that. I didn't feel vindicated. I just felt sad, not for me, for them, for the ones left behind trying to make a system work without knowing what pieces were missing. I had kept those notes in my head, in my planner, in the way I glanced at a schedule and just knew when something was off. Jason didn't have that. He had reports, he had charts, he had colors, but he didn't have connection. By Friday, 6 different vendors had contacted me. None of them said anything about the new leadership. None asked who replaced me. All they asked was some version of the same question. Can we still call you if we're not sure who to talk to? And I said yes. Not because I needed to stay involved, but because I couldn't bear the thought of them trying to get through a winter season without someone checking the detours, without someone reminding them that construction was picking up near Route 17, without someone noticing that weather patterns were shifting the hauls by 3 hours every Thursday. I wasn't trying to interfere. I wasn't trying to make a point. But people were calling me, not the system, not the new title, me. Because when you've been a steady voice for 2 decades, silence doesn't feel like a clean break. It feels like something's missing, and they could feel it. I don't know exactly when Jason realized something was off. Maybe it was the day 2 separate haulers missed their dock times because no one told them the construction zone had moved 3 miles south. Or maybe it was when the southern vendor stopped confirming orders altogether and quietly rerouted a third of their inventory to our competitor in Cincinnati. But I do know this. He didn't see it coming. Because for weeks, everything looked fine on paper. The dashboards were clean, orders were logged, routes were highlighted, deliveries showed as in progress. The software did what it was told. But the people behind it, they had already stepped back. I heard from Frank again, the Montana driver. He left a voicemail this time, said he was done trying to explain delays to people who don't listen. He didn't sound angry, just tired. There was a kind of weight in his voice, like someone dragging a chain behind them without knowing how long it's been there. I saved the message, not because I needed proof, but because it reminded me why I'd stayed so long. It was never the salary. It wasn't the job title. It was the trust, the quiet rhythm of people who depended on each other, not just on systems. Back in the office, I imagined Jason sitting at my old desk, the one next to the east window that caught the morning light. I wondered if he kept the blinds open or if he found it distracting. I pictured him clicking through delivery logs, watching red flags pop up on the dashboard, not knowing why they were blinking. Because the system didn't tell him about road closures. It didn't remind him that one of the northbound drivers couldn't run Thursdays anymore because his wife had started chemo. It didn't know that Delilah's dispatches had to be shifted every second Friday so she could pick up her grandson. Those weren't glitches. They were human realities. And I had carried them. Not because I was asked to, but because someone needed to. There was a time when those details were written down, in notebooks, margins, sticky notes on monitors, but over the years they moved into memory, into instinct. I didn't need a reminder to check the wind reports near the river corridor. I just knew that stretch of highway turned ugly when the temperature dipped below 40. Jason didn't know that, and no one had told him. I wasn't watching them fail. That's not what it felt like. It felt more like watching a machine spin just a little too fast. Everything in place, technically working but ever so slightly out of rhythm, like a wheel that hums until the bolts loosen. Then the shaking begins, then the noise, then the silence. By the end of that week, 4 more vendors had gone quiet, not out of anger, just absence. They stopped replying to check-ins. They didn't reject new terms. They just didn't return calls. That's how you know you've lost someone in this business, not by what they say, but by what they stop saying. It was a Thursday morning when the 12th vendor pulled out, not with a confrontation, not with a legal notice, just a message sent quietly through the portal. We will not be renewing our distribution agreement at this time. No explanation, no suggested edits, just a clean, cold sentence. I wasn't supposed to see it. I was no longer on the system. But word travels. One of the drivers called me that evening, not for gossip, but because he needed to know what to do. Do I still drop at Calgrove tomorrow? He asked. They didn't send the dock times. That ever happened before? I didn't answer right away, because no, it hadn't. Not once in 17 years. Vendor #12 was a linchpin. Not the biggest, not the most profitable, but the most consistent. They handled mid-sized freight across 2 key regional corridors. The kind of hauls that weren't flashy but kept the whole schedule balanced. If they paused service, it wouldn't crash the system in a day, but it would start to pull the edges loose. Fewer hands, longer hauls, more strain on the secondary carriers. Everything gets a little tighter, then slower, then late. Jason sent out an internal memo the next day explaining that the vendor had chosen to explore new alignment opportunities. He thanked the logistics team for their adaptability. He included 3 bullet points about alternative routes under consideration, but behind closed doors, I imagine he wasn't so calm. Because vendor hash 12 didn't leave for alignment. They left because they no longer trusted the hands holding the map. Frank called again that weekend. He had heard from 2 other drivers that delays were stacking, missed offload windows, calls not returned, dispatchers asking questions that used to be answered before the shipment left the yard. "It's not panic yet," he said, "but people are noticing." I sat with that sentence for a long time. People are noticing, not shouting, not revolting, just noticing. That's always how it starts. A question here, a strange delay there, a missed step that no one can explain. The people inside the system keep moving, Fry, because they have to. But the trust starts to pull back, inch by inch, like a tide. I could have called someone. I could have sent a message. But I didn't. Not out of pride, not even out of strategy. I didn't say anything because they hadn't asked. And until they did, the silence wasn't mine to break. That weekend, I drove past the main distribution hub just once, out of habit. The lights were still on, the dock bays still moving. But the rhythm was different. I couldn't explain it. It just felt heavier, slower, like a house where the floorboards haven't buckled yet, but the foundation knows. Something had shifted, and the building knew it before the people did. The call came on a Tuesday. Not early, not late, just after lunch. The kind of time when a conversation can slip in unnoticed if you let it. I didn't recognize the number, but something about the area code felt familiar. When I answered, the voice on the other end didn't say his name. He didn't have to. I had heard it enough in boardrooms and town halls and shareholder videos. It was the CEO, and not the kind of CEO who remembers birthdays or knows what kind of coffee the haulers drink. The kind who signs glossy letters in annual reports and uses phrases like synergistic growth without blinking. He didn't waste time on pleasantries, just said, "We're noticing some inconsistency in fulfillment data and vendor response rates. I wanted your perspective." For a moment, I didn't speak, not because I was shocked, but because I wanted to hear how he filled the silence. He didn't. He waited, which told me this wasn't just curiosity. This was concern. Controlled, of course, tidy, polished, but concern nonetheless. I asked, "Have the vendors been answering your team?" He said, "We've had some difficulty aligning expectations." I asked, "And the system logs?" He paused, said they were reviewing usage patterns and timestamps, which meant yes, the flags were there, but no one knew how to read them. I didn't give him a theory. I didn't suggest solutions. I didn't even ask who was handling my old role. I simply said, "In this business, people don't always announce when they're gone. Sometimes they just stop showing up." He didn't respond right away. Then, "So, if there's something deeper happening you think they'll say?" I told him they already did, you just weren't listening. There was a silence long enough that I could hear paper moving on his desk, maybe a pen, maybe nothing. Then he asked, "Would you consider consulting?" The word landed flat. It wasn't insulting, just tired, like a flashlight switched on too late. I said, "I think the people who mattered most already gave you their feedback." He exhaled, a quiet, private sound, then thanked me for my time. I didn't save the number. I didn't expect another call, but I knew what that conversation meant. Not that he understood what had gone wrong, but that for the first time, he realized something had, and not just a metrics problem, a structure problem, a trust problem, something you can't chart, something you only feel when it's missing, like heat after a power outage, or gravity in a dream, invisible until it's not there. That evening, I didn't feel victorious, but I did feel still, like I had finally stepped outside of a building that kept shaking even after I left, and I let it shake. It rained that Monday. Not a heavy storm, not dramatic, just a long gray drizzle that soaked through your sleeves before you realized it had started. I woke early, not because I had somewhere to be, but because I knew what day it was. Mondays were always the tightest in our cycle. Weekend hauls came in back-to-back, dock times overlapped, and every minute lost before noon would cost an hour by dusk. It wasn't a guess. It was math, rhythm, muscle memory, and I knew. This was the week it would finally show. I didn't check the system. I couldn't. But my phone buzzed before 7. Then again, then again. Not from vendors, not from drivers, from old coworkers, quiet ones, the kind who never emailed unless it mattered. One message just said, "Do you remember the protocol if 2 zones crash at once?" Another wrote, "Was there a backup for vendor 8's crossdock when Route 4 is down?" I didn't answer, not because I didn't know, but because answering now wouldn't save them from what came next. That's what happens when you let the web tear. It doesn't fall all at once. It unspools. Slowly, then all at once. By midday, 3 regional schedulers had gone offline. Jason sent an internal note asking for all team leads to coordinate manually until full systems resync. Someone forwarded it to me. No comment. I stared at the phrase for a long time. Resync. As if trust could be toggled like software. As if the people who kept the gears turning would just fall back in line because a spreadsheet said so. Frank called it too. He was parked outside a closed dock, second delay that week. "They don't even have the code," he said. "The new guy said he thought you left it in your notes." I told him I didn't, because I didn't. That code was never written down. It was built into a call I used to make every Sunday night, a quiet confirmation with the site lead. No email, no system, just one voice reminding another, "We good for 7:15. And now, there was no call, no reminder, just a gate that stayed shut and a delivery that stayed late. By end of day, someone from corporate issued a blanket statement. Operational strain expected to persist through Q3 due to seasonal volatility. It made me laugh, not because it was funny, but because the storm they were in wasn't seasonal. It was structural, and it wasn't volatility. It was vacancy, the absence of care, of pattern, of quiet instincts built over years. You can't replace that with automation. You can't hire that in 30 days. You either have it or you had it. That night, I sat on my porch with the lights off. I listened to the rain on the eaves and thought about all the Mondays I had survived, the ones that nearly broke me, the ones that sharpened me, the ones that no one thanked me for, but never quite fell apart. I didn't feel sorry for them, not anymore. I just felt distant, like watching a house fall from the other side of a river. You can see it crumble, but you don't cross, not this time. By Thursday morning, the forecast had stopped being a warning. It had become the weather itself, wet, heavy, relentless. Calls weren't just late, they weren't coming. Orders weren't just delayed, they were vanishing mid-route. But it wasn't until I heard from Carla that I knew the tide had turned. She was one of the last still inside who remembered what it had felt like when things worked. She called late, her voice low like someone whispering in a church that had long been abandoned. "He got the email," she said, "from DeSoto." I didn't speak. I didn't need to. DeSoto wasn't just any client. They were the anchor account, the one that steadied our entire western corridor. If they were upset, the system wouldn't bend. It would break. No, she went on. They CC'd legal, called it unacceptable operational deviation, said they'd be halting new orders until further notice. I closed my eyes, not because it surprised me, but because I could hear the shape of that email, every word wrapped in forced politeness and buried threat. "And the CEO?" I asked. She hesitated, then, "He's shaken, said he thought they were stable. He thought—" She trailed off, and then quieter. "He asked where you kept the call logs." I almost laughed, almost, but I didn't. Because I remembered that feeling, reaching for something that used to be second nature, only to realize it's gone, not hidden, not lost, just no longer yours. By evening, the regional scheduler from the North Corridor posted a resignation notice. No reason, just a quiet goodbye message in the team portal. This wasn't what I signed up for. Below it, a few emojis, a few silent reactions, but mostly nothing. That's what it had become, people leaving in silence, systems drifting without direction, and still, no one said my name, not officially, but I could feel it, in the hesitation, in the way Carla called me, not anyone else, in the way the CEO asked about logs that were never on paper because they had lived in a person, in me. Frank left me one final message that night, just 7 words. I wish they had understood what mattered. He didn't need to say more. I played the voicemail twice, then I deleted it, not out of anger, but because the message wasn't mine to hold. The consequence had already arrived. The choice had already been made. Somewhere in an office that used to hold my chair, someone was staring at a glowing screen, trying to find the place where everything had started to go wrong, but they wouldn't find it, because it didn't start with a mistake. It started with a removal, a quiet subtraction of something they thought was extra. They didn't lose me because of failure. They lost me because they mistook presence for permanence, and now they were calling it unexpected client behavior. But it wasn't unexpected, not to me. It was the last piece falling in the exact place I knew it would. They didn't send a formal offer, just a calendar hold. 45 minutes marked strategic operations recalibration. No subject line, no agenda, just a slot. Early morning, my time, not theirs. That alone told me enough. It wasn't curiosity anymore. It was reach. Quiet, careful reach from people who had spent weeks pretending my absence didn't matter. I didn't decline. I didn't accept. I let it sit, untouched, unread, because what they needed wasn't a meeting. It was a memory, one they'd erased too early. By that point, 3 directors had stepped down. 2 more had gone on leave. Carla stopped replying to internal threads altogether, and Jason, the man who once deleted my name from the core directory, was now sending out daily updates with phrases like cross-functional recovery and relationship re-engagement. But the vendors weren't replying, the routes weren't stabilizing, and the clients had started looking elsewhere. I heard from one of them actually, a small logistics firm in the Midwest, not big but smart. They asked if I'd be open to a consult, not with a deck, not with a proposal, just a walkthrough. "We're trying to build something human," the message read. "We heard you know how." I sat with that email longer than I expected, not because I needed the work, but because the wording struck something in me. Human. That's what it had always been about. Not metrics, not dashboards, but memory, rhythm, trust. I didn't go back to the company. I didn't even write a goodbye. Because there was nothing left to leave. The building stood, but the structure had collapsed long before, not in a single crash, but in quiet unravelings, missed calls, unanswered shifts, doors that didn't open when they used to. They would survive, maybe, rebuild, rebrand, recover. But not with me, not with the people who remembered what it had meant to move as one. One morning I drove past the Northern Depot, just once. The gates were still closed, no haulers in sight, a single security light flickering overhead. I rolled down the window, listened. Nothing, no beeping, no clatter, just wind. And for the first time in years, I didn't feel the pull to fix it, to step in, to hold it steady. I just let it be what it had become. A system without its center, and I was no longer theirs to call. I stopped checking launch dates. The cycles I once lived by, shipments, freight, handovers, had all gone quiet, but small echoes remained. Someone said they'd hired a new coordinator. Carla messaged, "They renamed your system." I knew what that meant. A new training role was posted. A leaked memo spoke of rebuilding vendor trust, and a stranger on LinkedIn stood proudly in front of a dashboard I had once built from scratch. Different skin, same bones. My name was gone, but the frame was still mine. They hosted webinars, announced reforms, used words like innovation, synergy, resilience, but I could tell it was all noise, the cadence was off, the silences meant nothing, and the hands behind the system didn't know how to listen. A competitor once called just to ask, "How did you last that long?" I told her I didn't, I just knew where to carry the cracks. She went quiet, then said, "We're losing people faster than we can train them." I said, "Loyalty isn't built, it's protected." That's what they missed. They replaced processes, not presence. What held the system together wasn't policy, it was knowing. Who might be out next week? When fog would close the river road? What it meant if Frank didn't call by 10? They rebuilt, or tried to. New logo, new roles. But I saw through it. A glossy copy with no center. Polished, but hollow. Months later, I passed the old Southern Depot. One truck backed in, awkwardly alone. No hand signals, no shared rhythm, just gravel and cold silence. And for once, I felt nothing. They had rebuilt, but I wasn't replaced, and they knew it. If you've ever built something that only worked because you were there, because you knew when to speak and when to stay silent, then you already understand what this story is really about. It's not revenge, it's recognition. The kind that comes quietly, long after the applause has faded. If it reminded you of something, a place, a name, a voice that kept the whole thing moving, share it. Someone out there needs to know they weren't the only one holding the system together.